Hello, everybody. Excennial Thought here. And today I want to talk about a topic that I'm sure many people are familiar with, and it has to do with taking online tests. So, why do we take online tests? I'm sure different people have different reasons, but I think in general, people are curious about learning more about themselves, um, or it's just sheer boredom or a combination of the two. But I guess what is the real value in taking all these tests other than just to kind of kill time? And I think some of the tests are more legitimate than others. Some of them are probably just complete bullshit. Some of them I think are more legitimate. I think the IQ test has some uh, evidence to back those up. I've taken a fair amount of IQ tests. I think a lot of the ones online that I've taken are probably not accurate, and there are some that I've taken online that were supposedly legitimate or Mensa approved. But in general, out of all the tests I've taken, including the Mensa ones, it's almost always high 120s to low 130s, so it averages out to about 130. So I don't know if that's true or not or accurate. If it's 130, I'll take it. That seems pretty good. But maybe the only way to get a legitimate IQ test is to take one of the Mensa ones in person. That's a official administered ones by Mensa. I don't know, but um, I've also taken the Mayer-Briggs type of tests many times. When I was young, it typically was an ENFP. Now that I'm a fully fledged adult and member of society, it's almost always ENTP, which is basically upbeat visionary. They highly value knowledge and spend much of their lives seeking a higher understanding. They live in a world of possibilities and become excited about concept challenges and difficulties. When presented with a problem, they're good at improvising and quickly come up with a creative solution. Creative, clever, curious, and theoretical, ENTPs have a broad range of possibilities in their lives. So that's all to say that sounds reasonably accurate for myself. I've kind of taken a jigsaw puzzle of a life path so far, and I've got my hands and mind in a lot of different things, which is just fine by me. I like variety and I like new things and I like exploring all the time. So that seems reasonably accurate. Astrologically speaking, my sun sign's Aquarius, my moon sign's Scorpio, and I'm very freedom loving. I'm very independent. My rising sign's Capricorn, and I was born in the year of the dog. So there's that. And then the last test I've taken a few times has been the 5 major personality traits test. And so I almost always score very high in conscientiousness, middle of the road, very high in openness, middle of the road with conscientiousness, very high in extrovertism, middle of the road with agreeableness, and very low in neuroticism. And so that's all fine and everything. How accurate or how valuable are these tests? I don't know. At the end of the day, it's kind of what you make of them. And if you get some value out of those, or they help you make a better life decision, or they help you steer in a direction that is positive for you or for people around you, then sure, why not? But if people just obsess over these tests all the time and just take test after test, and it prevents them from actually getting anything productive or doing what they're supposed to be doing if they're at work or wherever else, then maybe it's not such a good thing. As far as astrology, I know some people are very, very into astrology, and I have mixed feelings about it. I think it is interesting on a level, and I think there might be something to it, um, because I do see patterns in life around me with people I know. So my dad and my brother, they're both Scorpios, so I grew up with Scorpio guys, and they definitely exhibit a lot of the typical traits of Scorpios, right? They're very passionate. They are very, they keep their cards close to their chest, I would say. They don't like to reveal too much. They're very good at managing money. They're very good with finances, and they're very good at strategizing and thinking ahead. And like I said, they're passionate, but in a quiet, subdued sort of way. So they can be really loyal, good friends and look out for their friends and family. But if you cross them, then watch out, buddy. That's for sure. Um, So I do see these things around me, but as far as when people start getting into horoscopes and they start getting into um, Saturn was crossing Mars's transit and the node of Jupiter was crossing the threshold of Uranus, while your dog was, in a spacesuit flying around the orbit of moon or the moon. It just gets ridiculous. And there's really no way to scientifically verify any of these things with any type of evidence, right? So when you talk about the more general attributes of somebody, the reason why I think there might be something to that, as far as maybe sun sign or even moon sign or like phase shift in your life, apparently you're born as a certain sun sign, and then after, I think it's about 30 years, you go into another sun sign, and that's a major life shift. And then with the moon sign, it's every 30 months, you go into a different moon. The reason why I think there might be a little bit more something to that, and I think it could potentially be validated by science at some point, but it hasn't been yet, is because I've noticed these shifts and I've seen them in my own life, and I've seen them with other people around me. So I've noticed with my life, I'll go through these little shifts or these little phases every few years where I'm on to certain things, or I'm in a certain pattern, or I have a certain career, or I'm studying certain things. And then in my attitude toward life and the way I view things around me and my perspective is on a certain level or a certain wavelength, and it starts to shift over time with how I view relationships, with how I view women, with how I view my family, with how I view jobs and careers and my education, and how I view or value different things in my life. That shifts and it changes. There's no doubt about that. Does it directly correspond every 30 months? Probably not necessarily, but there are shifts. Anyway, the reason why I think that there might be something to that is because I think it has something to do with qualities of light and electromagnetism. And so hear me out. I know it sounds insane, but the quality of light that reaches the planet Earth changes, and it changes all the time, but it changes seasonally, right? So we know that gravity bends light, and it's basically like you see with a sunset, right? So normally if we have direct sunlight, it's white. So when gravity actually bends light coming at a specific angle, so around the sunset or a sunrise, you're actually spreading the light out, right? And so you're seeing like a red shift as it goes away from you, or it's bent. And so the same thing happens seasonally. So the Earth is actually tilted on its axis. And so the quality of light or the directness of light that's hitting Earth at any given time, it'll change seasonally. And we haven't directly measured how that can affect the creation or the development of a fetus inside of a woman's womb after conception. So we do know this for sure, that the pineal gland and the differentiation between female and male sex happens, I think it's like 40 some days after conception. Strangely, in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, that's how much time passes in between lives after you die, is something like 40 some days between a soul going from one body to another, right? And so I don't think anyone has any idea of how light and electromagnetism affects the cells in a woman's body, or like anybody for that matter, but particularly when they're being developed in a fetus or they're growing in a fetus and the cells are starting to have and multiply, and the fetus is slowly growing into a fully fledged newborn child, right? And so there might be some kind of effect there, and there might be some kind of effect throughout our lives that light around us has. I don't think it's something that's been explored very much at all. And the reason I think that is because it might be an instrumentation limit. So there are a lot of things around us at all times that we don't see. There's electromagnetism flowing through our body at all times. And a lot of it comes from cell towers, it comes from cosmic rays, it comes from the sun, it comes from electromagnetism from the Earth's core. it's basically flowing through us at all times at different frequencies, and we don't really notice it. The only light that we really notice is in the infrared spectrum, we'll feel it as heat, and then also in the visible spectrum, we'll see it reflect off different things around us, and it goes into our eyes, and then we view it as images and things happening around us. So there are many other effects. There are many other things that could be affecting our consciousness, things that could be affecting how we feel, how we perceive, and they could shift over time, but we don't have the instrumentation dialed in, or maybe it's too subtle for us to measure currently at this time. And so the instrumentation limit has always been an issue with scientific measurements. And I mean, it goes back since the dawn of science. And as instrumentation gets smaller and more refined, and we are starting and we're able to measure things smaller and smaller and more subtle, and also measure things that we've never measured before, it gives us a broader and wider of understanding about the nature of reality around us. So, I mean, a great example is a microscope. A few hundred years ago, when there was no microscopes, we wouldn't be able to see cells. And then once you have electron imaging and our ability to look even at smaller and smaller things like molecules and compounds and atoms, and then eventually inside atoms, that all has to do with better and better instrumentation and the refinement of instrumentation that allows us to peer closer and closer to those type of things, right? And that's just one example. So there are many natural phenomena that we're beginning to explore more and more. Here's another great example, CERN, right? So CERN is basically that giant loop that's in Europe where they smash protons together at extremely high velocities, and then they just try and figure out what kind of particles are formed from smashing these proton particles together, right? And so before they had CERN, there was a lot less understanding about how some of these primordial particles formed. And now that they're starting to smash these protons together, they're able to see more and more with these direct measurements. Same thing with the gravity wave detector. So just within the last couple of years, this is actually a really interesting story. They detected the gravitational waves that were propagating from two black holes that had collided. And this is the first time they've directly measured gravitational waves that were predicted by Einstein's theories of relativity, right? And so this is an instrumentation thing. Before we had these gravity wave detectors in place, there's two of them, and they're in the US, and I think they're perpendicular to each other, and that's the only way you can directly measure it. Before we had these in place, able to measure gravity waves, there was no way to directly measure gravitational waves except through theory, except through some of these theories. So suffice to say, where I'm going with all this is what I really alluded to earlier, is that there are a lot of things around us that we don't perceive directly or able to indirectly. We're limited by what we can perceive, and we're limited by our instrumentation limits currently. But we just see a very, very small sliver. We perceive a very, very small sliver of the totality of reality. There is so much more going on around us that we can't even imagine the totality of the energy flowing in and out. Do dimensions overlay on our dimension? Are they interposed within our dimension, but we just don't perceive it? Think about aliens, think about ghosts, things like that. They could all be a part of our reality, but we just don't perceive it because we're not tuned into it, right? And so that actually brings me to another thing I want to talk about, which is DMT, and a book called The Spirit Molecule by Rick Strassman. It's a really fascinating book, and it's an interesting topic. I think I'm going to save that for another video, and I'll go into that a little more in depth. But with this video, I just want to talk about some of these tests that people take, and why they can be interesting, they can be fun, and ultimately they shouldn't be taken too seriously. But